and I'd like to welcome all of you to the USS Midway Museum, and I'd also like to welcome all of our viewers who are watching this over our live stream. And Jack Gench is giving instructions here. Beautiful. Always the captain, right? Today, of course, is a very important occasion, not only because it's the National Vietnam War Veterans Day, but because today is also the 50th anniversary of when the last U.S. troops left Vietnam. It's also the last day that Jack Gench, or 50 years ago today, that Jack Gench and the last group of POWs left Hanoi. So all of us here on the Midway are very, very honored to host this ceremony to recognize and thank those veterans who served in the Vietnam era, which actually goes all the way back to November of 1955 and lasted through May of 1975. And before we get started, I'd like to recognize some people here that deserve a little bit of a special recognition. But before I start, could I have everybody who's not a Vietnam veteran stand? And can you give an applause to all the Vietnam veterans? It's for you guys. So before we get started, like I said, I'd like to recognize a few people that are here with us today. He probably doesn't want me to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'd like to recognize our founding CEO and President, Rear Admiral Mac McLaughlin. Where is Mac? Somewhere here. So many of you may have seen the article in the Union Tribune a little earlier this week that talked about Mac's legacy as he plans to retire. In fact, today is his last day on the job, and he told me, don't muck it up on my last day. So I'll try my best. It really was his vision and leadership that has made Midway what it is today. So we want to thank Mac very much. And I think Mac's successor, Rear Admiral Terry Kraft. Terry, are you up here this morning? Anyway, here he is in the back. Okay. So Terry is going to be the successor for Mac. He takes over today. And we're just delighted to have the handoff from Mac, who's just done such an incredible job over the last 20 years, to Terry, who will be taking the reins a little later on this afternoon. And I'm going to recognize Royce Williams, who is coming up right now. Yeah, there he is. Wonderful. I'd like to also recognize Mayor Todd Gloria. Todd, if you could raise your hand there. As you know, Todd is a huge supporter of the military and the veterans and the USS Midway. About a year and a half ago, Todd initiated his Military Veterans and Family Advisory Council to ensure that San Diego is and remains the most welcoming city for Navy or for military veterans and their families in the entire country. So, Todd, thank you very much for being here. I'd also like to recognize a number of POWs that we have with us this morning. As I mentioned, Jack Gench is with us. We also have Al Molinari, Earl Lewis, and Paul Granger. If you guys could raise your hand and be acknowledged. And we also have family members from Vice Admiral Stockdale and Martin's family. Both Admiral Stockdale and Martin were long-held POWs, so thank you also very much for that. And finally, where's Ray Slapkunis? Ray's here somewhere representing the Coast Guard. So Ray, thank you very much for being here as well. And we also have some very special guest speakers with, and I will get into that a little later on in the program. But first, I'd like to be just delighted to let you know that we have the Navy Medical Center San Diego Color Guard with us today to present the colors, as well as Nina Church, who will sing our national anthem. So if I can ask Nina to come up. And if I could ask everybody to please rise while we present the colors and for the national anthem. Color Guard, advance the colors.
say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we'd hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we'd watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Retire the colors. I'd now like to introduce the volunteer chaplain for the USS Midway, Paul Chappie Ward. And Chappie had one responsibility besides doing the invocation and benediction today, and that was to keep the rain off our heads until 10:15 this morning. And so far, he's holding on to that promise.
You're welcome to join me for the invocation and pray according to the practices of your faith as I pray in mine. Let us pray. Almighty God, on this day aboard the USS Midway, America's living symbol of freedom, we honor the approximately 2.7 million American men and women who served in Vietnam. We remember the more than 58,000 servicemen and women who lost their lives and are missing in action, whose names are engraved upon the black granite of the wall in our nation's capital. We remember the 1,584 Americans who are still missing and unaccounted for. We pray for their families and friends, those who are left to mourn their loss, and we ask that they may be comforted by the knowledge of our support and by our tears. While the majority of American veterans that successfully readjusted to post-war life, a substantial number of Vietnam-era veterans have experienced, faced, or suffered from a wide range of life adjustment issues: PSTD, homelessness, substance abuse, suicide, and the effects of Agent Orange. Please bring healing to those veterans who are still hurting. Please grant patience and wisdom to those around who cannot understand, but sometimes can help in the healing process. Bless now the families and friends of those that we honor today, and bless our Vietnam veterans who have come with memories, stories, and tears to enrich this day. Amen.
Thank you, Chappie. Please be seated. During the Vietnam War, more than 9 million U.S. service members served on active duty, and nearly 3 million actually served in the Vietnam combat area. Sadly, as Chappie mentioned, more than 58,000 paid the ultimate sacrifice, and more than 150,000 came home with physical wounds. Countless others, unfortunately, also suffered from psychological and trauma wounds that even after 50 years still haven't healed. The tremendous bravery demonstrated by those who fought in Vietnam is unparalleled. And unlike the other wars where blood of U.S. service members was spilled, those who fought in Vietnam for the first time in our nation's history were not always welcomed home as the heroes that they were. After 5 decades, all of us here on the Midway feel that it is very important that we recognize the incredible service and sacrifice of these extraordinary patriots. And while it's important that all Americans understand that warriors should never be blamed for the war, it is equally important to ensure that future generations remember the courage of our Vietnam War veterans and that they demonstrated on the distant battlefields of Southeast Asia. And as was mentioned a little earlier, today is actually based upon the bill that was signed in 2017, National Vietnam War Veterans Day. So we're really blessed to have 4 guest speakers with us who are tremendously wonderful human beings. And I'm proud to say each of them are the finest of American patriots, even though one of them was actually born in Vietnam. Each will reflect on how their heroic, harrowing, and heartbreaking experiences during the war changed their lives and the lives of their families forever. We have retired Navy Commander Everett Alvarez. Everett was a Navy pilot flying off the decks of the USS Constellation over North Vietnam. And in 1960, actually, he was flying the A-4 Skyhawk that we have just up here on the bow. And on August 4th, 1964, he was shot down on a bombing mission in the aftermath of the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Captured by the North Vietnamese, he spent nearly 9 years as a prisoner of war. He's actually the second longest held POW in U.S. history. We also have retired Marine Corps Colonel Jim Collins, deployed to Vietnam as a sergeant, I believe, yep. And was in 1969 and was a member of a, let this go by. He was a member of a reconnaissance battalion. Jim was seriously wounded during combat, but through his tenacious determination, not only did he make a full recovery, he went back to school, got back into the Marine Corps, and became a Marine Corps fighter pilot. Courtney Herrmann was only 8 years old when the North Vietnamese invaded Saigon in '75. Along with her family, they made the miraculous escape and were flown by military helicopter right here to the Midway. So Midway is actually Courtney's first American home. And it was the start of her journey to freedom here in the United States. Sorry. And finally, Roy Knight. Roy was only 10 years old when his dad, an Air Force pilot, was shot down and killed. The last time he saw his dad was just before your 11th birthday, right? Yeah. So there's a long story about Roy and his father, and he'll tell you that here in just a few decades, a story that lasted 5 decades. So to start, it's my pleasure to introduce retired Colonel Jim Collins.
Morning. Hoorah! I'd like to thank the Midway. I'd like to thank San Diego, City of San Diego, City of Coronado, who've always been hospitable, supported military, active duty veterans and families. I'd like to thank my main support group, Commander Sherry Collins, U.S. Navy. My adventure, my Vietnam experience started in 1966 with a phone call to my mom. She told me that I had been invited to medical examination by the Selective Service. I had finished 4 years of college, and it was now my turn. I knew this was coming. I was resolved to serve. My dad and my uncles were World War II veterans. My high school Little League coach was a Marine. My Boy Scout troop leader was a Marine. My high school football, baseball coaches were a Marine. My high school Latin teacher was a Marine. I lived in a town, in a township where John Basilone, who is recognized here in Little Italy, Medal of Honor winner, was from there. So I was going to be a Marine. I signed up. I started up right up the harbor here at Marine Recruit Depot. And to my surprise, when we got our orders out of boot camp, I was one of only 2 out of my group that had orders to stay in San Diego. I was trained as a field radio operator with Morse code, extra Morse code training. That took some time, and I tried to figure out why they were training me in that specifically, and it came to find out that the Marines found out that I played some baseball, and I ended up playing for the Marine Corps baseball team. And they continued to send me to schools in the San Diego area so that I could continue to play. I finally wrangled some orders to Vietnamese language school, 14 weeks, and with that, a set of orders to Vietnam, to the 1st Recon Battalion in Da Nang. 1st Recon Battalion was part of 1st Marine Division, and their mission was to man observation posts and radar relay, but mostly to conduct patrols outside of division lines. We were mostly to observe, not to engage, but to observe and report activity. On one such patrol, there was very little activity, a lot of observation. There was a lot of movement. We were observing tributaries of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. A lot of vehicles, some airstrikes, some may have come off of the Midway even, but no involvement, direct involvement with the enemy with us. We had old French maps. They were probably from the 50s, so we were constantly updating them. And the routine was that we would give those updated maps to the team that came in to replace us. So as we were rushing to the helicopter to get on, as the new team was coming off, I handed those maps to the new team leader, and he handed me a manila envelope, which was very strange because the off-going team usually didn't get anything. Well, we left, we were on the helicopter driving in. I opened up the envelope, pulled it out, and it was a newspaper. It may have been Stars and Stripes. Big, bold headlines. The president says there are no troops in Laos. The French maps weren't good, but they weren't that bad. Towards the end of my tour, as a matter of fact, I had 2 weeks left. We got word that the regular North Vietnamese army was approaching Da Nang, a regiment-size force. We knew that they were active because they had been involved in the Tet Offensive in 1968, and I volunteered. That's the word that I don't use with relish. I volunteered to go on a company-sized patrol, which is much larger than ones that we usually we went out in 5- and 7-man teams. This time it was 10 and 12-man teams. First 3 or 4 days of that patrol, there wasn't much activity. The 4th day, we were walking along the side of brush on the side of a steep hill, and I looked out into the valley, and the valley was moving. The NVA were walking in the valley. They all had branches, bushes over their heads, and they were walking down through the valley so that trying to avoid detection by aircraft observers. We stayed put, and the both segments of that line of bushes went right around us, and it continued all night long. It was a long night. Nobody slept, but we avoided detection, and we got out of there the next day. As we proceeded out and tried to follow that group, there were a couple brief skirmishes, and we came upon an area that was elephant grass, and that's 8 to 10 foot tall grass, bamboo-like, very dry. It was August the 7th. And there were some bomb craters, and I walked around one to cover that area. I heard somebody shout, I think, and I looked down, and there was a sparkling going on down there. Next thing I know, I was up in the air. It was gray, it was black, it was loud, it was, and I just lost consciousness for a while, and I ended up in one of these bomb craters. There was a firefight that went on after that, and it worked out in our favor. And then they started to conduct a medevac to get me out of there. I looked up at my radio operator and I said, "No Willie Pete." Willie Pete was white phosphorus. It was a rocket that was often used to mark a landing zone. And the next thing you know, a Cobra came in and shot a Willie Pete and started a forest fire. So one of my teammates, big recon guy, picked me up like I was nothing and carried me about 150 yards upwind of the fire, and finally we got me out of there. I was medevac back to Da Nang, did some initial surgeries, had a number of them in Japan, Alaska, the Midwest someplace. Ended up in St. Albans Naval Hospital in Brooklyn. My family was from New Jersey, and they tried to place me someplace close to my family. While at that naval hospital, I was on the sergeant's ward, and the USO came in and said, we're going to take you down to Times Square tomorrow night. Put on your uniforms. Okay. So I was still on crutches, recuperating, and we got dressed up, and next night we got on a white Navy school bus and drove down to the area of Times Square, pulled off onto a side street and got out, walked into Times Square itself, got about a half a block, and we heard all the cliches, baby killers, got spit on, all the stuff that you heard about, read about. I just turned around and went back and sat on the back of the bus. And over the next 15 or 20 minutes, the rest of the sergeants trickled back, got on the bus. No words were spoken, no conversation, no bitching about what they had heard or what they had been subjected to. Just no conversation. Filled up the bus, went back to the hospital, still no words said. And until today, I still wonder what was going on in their mind, how they were processing what that particular event meant in the context of what they had been through, what they were going through, and in many respects what they would go through for the rest of their lives. They didn't have an event like this. There was no welcoming. Somewhere I hoped in there would be something that would happen to them that would give them a sense of pride in what they did. Something maybe not of this magnitude, but just maybe somebody coming up to them, giving them a sincere shake of the hand and saying, "Welcome home."
We're glad you're here.
Thank you, Jim. If I could now ask Roy Knight to come on up to the stage with us.
Good morning. First, I want to thank Midway and all of you for the opportunity to come up here and thank our Vietnam veterans and tell a little bit of our story. It's interesting, and I'll get to this in a minute, how some aspects of Colonel Collins' story kind of coincide with mine. Mine begins last day of school, May 19th, 1967, Millsap, Texas. We were in Millsap because that's where Dad put us as he went to serve his tour in Southeast Asia. Flew out of Thailand, but he hit targets in every package, North Vietnam, Laos, and South Vietnam. That day, I was going on a fishing trip with my uncles and my grandfather, and I was so excited. We immediately, as soon as I got home, we loaded up, went to the lake, got all set up in the cabin, set out the trout lines. We fished until after dark, had a great time. Went to bed. Next thing I know, my uncle's shaking me and whispering, "Get dressed." And then very quickly, another family member took me back home. As we got to the house, the yard was full of cars. There were people parked everywhere. The house was completely lit up. It was after midnight. I walked in, and my mother had been crying. There were people there, family, friends, people I didn't know. The house was full of people, and Mom had been crying. And she said, "Your dad's been shot down. We don't know if he's alive. We know that he was alive at some point after he was hit, but we don't know if he got out, and he was shot down over Laos." And incidentally, Colonel Collins, we were told you cannot say Laos. You could say Vietnamish area, you could say Southeast Asia, but we weren't in Laos. I, in my 11-year-old way, I knew Dad had survived and he was going to fight his way out and escape in the best John Wayne method, because, he was my dad. Let me tell you a little bit about my dad. He's tall, 6'2", 180 pounds, good looking by any measure. He's a handsome fellow, runs in the family. He was raised, he was the sixth of 7 sons, raised by a poor family in Texas, scratching out a living as farmers in tough times. Enlisted in the Air Force just a week after his 17th birthday, became the finest clerk typist in the United States Air Force, and went from that moment, he fought his way into the cockpit of a fighter, and he became a fighter pilot, and that's something. His family had seen war and its conditions before. His oldest brother was killed during World War II fighting in Burma and was awarded the Medal of Honor. The next oldest brother, Curtis, was badly wounded, was awarded the Silver Star. 2 other brothers served in combat throughout the entire war. So the family had already done a lot in that regard. So it's kind of a anyway, Dad he was my hero. He was the person I admired the most, and he was the person I wanted to emulate. So his loss was significant in every way. Being part of a military family, and a lot of people here will know exactly what I'm talking about, it is a different experience, and it is a fantastic experience. You not only have your family, but you have this extended family. It's the squadron or the base or the housing area. We as military brats, we had the pool, the BX, the theater where you stand up for the national anthem before they played the movie. stuff like that. It was a special existence. And wherever we were stationed, I knew that when I went out to play, the kids just like me, you know, military brats, go to school, almost every kid in there is going to be a military brat. So we understood each other, and it was awesome. You're part of a tribe. And it gets, in the more specialized areas, I guess, or it's probably true in every thing, but, you know, when you're the family of a fighter pilot, it's a tight community, and it is a tribe. It really is, and it's a cool thing to be part of. That day in May, all of that stopped. It stopped. The tribe had to move on. We stopped. We didn't know where we were going to be in the next month, the next year. We had no idea. We were just waiting to find out if he made it out. The war was going full blast. The country was, as Colonel Collins described, it was not pleasant, riots, etc., as it went on. And we felt that if we could just get to the point where the war would end and he would come home. And during this time period, we kept that hope alive. And to not do so would not be right to him. It would be not treating him right. So we were thrust into this limbo of existence that is sort of unique to the Vietnam War and for many families. As Dave said earlier, 1,500 families still waiting for resolution of their world. During that time, Mom would be called to go to a special building in Dallas that apparently didn't have any signs on it. And she would be asked to look at blurry pictures that had been smuggled out of apparently prison areas, whether it was actually North Vietnam or Laos or wherever. But they were unidentifiable pictures of men that were reported to be POWs, to see, is one of those your husband? Unfortunately, there were times when I said, could be, but unfortunately, never happened. Fast forward to the end of the war, and that day 50 years ago today, when the last flight came from Hanoi, and we were done with the war. And boy, were we done with the war. The world, the United States, they turned their back and pressed forward, and everything related to Vietnam, nobody talked about it, nobody wanted to talk about it. And that's unfortunate. For family members like us, we felt pretty much abandoned. But there were some people. I mean, there was, well, when we can get in there, we'll try to, find out if there's any remains and so on. But unfortunately, we didn't have any leverage at all, as everyone knows. Let's give that a second. There were some groups that kept the full accounting of our men in the forefront. An important one is the National League of Families of Prisoners of War Missing in Action in Southeast Asia. Sybil Stockdale was an important part of that initial effort, God bless her. And those wives who pressed on to make that happen during the war. As one of the wives I was talking to not too long ago, she said, nothing was happening. We wanted something to happen, so a bunch of us got together and we had some bottles of wine. What could go wrong? But it turned into a major effort. Other grassroots organizations of just good Americans just wanted to resolve this, sprung up. And as all of you witnessed over the years, eventually it picked up steam and it became more and more important. And things like the POW bracelet, the ubiquitous shadow or profile of a prisoner, those things now, I mean, that flag is on every post office, it's everywhere. And it's because people, regular Americans, said, you will not forget our men and you will keep the promise and you will bring them home, and kept that pressure on. In our particular case, we had pretty much given up hope. Dad's crash site, well known, had been excavated twice. While they had pulled out some artifacts, they never got any remains. And it was basically about to be relegated to the unable to recover file. But one guy, one recovery specialist by the name of Dane Magoon, what a great name, said, I think we should go back and take one more look. And on February 1st, 2019, the forensic archaeologist for the team, a young lady by the name of Ali Campo, who is an amazing human being, gathered the entire team at Dad's crash site, raised a can of Laotian beer, poured a little bit on the ground, and then led the team in singing happy birthday to my father on his 88th birthday that day. A few days later, they found parts of his helmet, and shortly after that, they found my dad. Thank you. And it was a wonderful thing. And when the DPA called and said, we have good news, it was like, yes, you have good news, but it's not good news too, because you have to go through all of that grieving process all over again. Dad's homecoming happened in August of 2019. So a couple of great things happened. I mean, it was an amazing, remarkable experience in every way, of course. But the United States Air Force and Southwest Airlines went above and beyond and made some amazing things happen. My brother was a Southwest captain at the time. Southwest could not move remains, and it just started flights from Hawaii, and none of the paperwork was in place for them to do any of that. Well, they made it happen. And my brother picked up the flight in Oakland and flew my father to Dallas Love Field, where my brother had said goodbye to him when he was 5 years old, 52 years previously. It's pretty cool. The trip from there to our hometown was amazing. Wherever we went, there were people coming up to the streets with their hands over their hearts and their hats off their heads. So driving through the streets of Dallas, there's a guy in a cherry picker 30 feet above the ground, and he's standing at attention in the bucket with his hard hat over his heart as we went by. When we got on I-20 headed west, cars stopped on both sides of the freeway and got out. And if they didn't have their phone up, they had their hands over their heart. It was a beautiful thing. And it was, to me, kind of a welcome home for Dad. But also, it was, they did not know Dad. They did not know who he was. But they knew that a fallen warrior was going by. And they rendered honors to him as they should. When we got into the cemetery, and the Air Force Honor Guard did a spectacular job. But one thing really stands out, and that is 4 F-16s of the 149th Fighter Wing, the gunslingers, the Texas Air National Guard, did the missing man flyover. When they came up to the cemetery, and I guess National Guards kind of cheated a little bit. They seemed awful low to me. Anyhow, they came and they were just so beautiful, and they were tight. And as they came in, the second element lead, he pulled, and normally when you do the missing man, the second element lead pulls up and the formation stays intact with that missing slot, and they just continue on. In this case, all that was the same, and then the guy that pulls turns to the west. In this particular case, I'd never seen it before, and I've seen a lot of them. He pulled, went straight vertical, and slow rolled until he disappeared. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. If you've not seen a missing man, I defy you to watch one and not have tears. Two more quick things. During the time that I was a young man, when I was like 13, 14 years old, I started acting up a little bit. I needed what Dad provided and was no longer being given. And so my mother, God bless her, decided to send me to a military school, St. John's Military School in Salina, Kansas. And I went there, and with the help and mentorship of some outstanding combat veterans, Air Force, Army, and Marine Corps, with attack officers and the commandant. I was given the tools that I needed and the values reinforced that my father had given me. And I thank God for those guys. Small world, sitting right over, where'd he go? Well, he's moved, but somewhere, there he is. Right over there is Al Ransom, Colonel Al Ransom, United States Marine Corps retired, who also went to that military school. His class of 56, the year I was born, and he was a battalion commander. I was class of 74, battalion commander. So we were mule skinners, little mule skinner connection there. And then finally, on the day that my father flew into infinity, a young Air Force sergeant from Grand Rapids, Michigan, strapped him in and had him 2 frozen canteens of water and said, "Good hunting, come back," and then directed him to the arming area. And Dad took off and didn't come back. His name, Richard Whitwood, tried to connect me on the 10-year anniversary of the fall of Saigon, and we missed each other. It was after Dad was brought home, he was able to reach out and connect with me. And we got together and we had that closure. And we got together right here on the deck of the Midway. And Chappie, who gave the invocation earlier, was our tour guide and an outstanding representative of this amazing organization that is the Midway. You guys, God bless you for what you do. And finally, I just want to say, part of me will always be 11 years old, believe it or not. Looking at me now. Part of me stopped that day in May, but things like this help. And I just want to say to all you Vietnam veterans out there, God bless you. Welcome home. Thank you.
Thank you, Roy. Courtney, your turn. If you would please come on up on stage.
Good morning. Ooh, it's cold. First of all, I would like to thank Dave Coons for inviting me to this special commemoration, Colonel Collins and Commander Alvarez for your leadership and service, and Roy Knight for sharing your father's amazing story. I would also like to acknowledge and thank all the veterans, and especially the Vietnam veterans, for their dedication and service to our great nation. My story is that of an 8-year-old child growing up between 1973 and 1975 in Saigon, Vietnam, and her journey to America. I recall walking to school petrified, listening to the bone-chilling sounds of bombs falling in the distance. I remember sharing with my mother that I didn't want to go to school, that I was scared. She explained in her own comforting words that these sounds, although dangerous, were far away and temporary. I believed my mother's words and continued to make my daily walks to school. South Vietnamese soldiers began to enter our home and those of our neighbors for routine checks. The orders were to ensure that none of us were sheltering any Viet Cong. Although our lives were interrupted by these routine checks, strangely enough, and through the eyes of a child, they were exciting at first. I regularly eavesdropped on my parents as they discussed about the war, but I never understood what it really meant. One day, I watched my parents scramble to sew carry-ons, and then when I asked what they were for, my mother's response was that we needed them for personal items and food as we were planning to leave Saigon. Somehow, I thought we were leaving to see my father's parents in Hue, which is a city in central Vietnam. But my mother replied that we were leaving Vietnam as the Viet Cong were invading Saigon. And living under the wrath of communism was not an option. Fear also drove their decision to leave, as my father, a former high-ranking officer in the South Vietnamese Army, would certainly be subjected to torture and possible death. Days before the fall of Saigon, we were awakened in the middle of the night by my parents as those bone-chilling sounds returned, but this time they were much louder. We were instructed to crawl on the floor towards my Uncle Tan, who was waiting outside to help us board a small transport bus. I then realized this was the moment we all dreaded. I watched my mother hand our house key to our neighbor, asking her to watch over our home. We left for the airport and stopped to pick up my Aunt Jacqueline and her three young daughters along the way. As we made our way to Saigon International Airport, I thought we were the only family leaving the country. But upon arrival, realized that thousands of desperate faces, also gripped by fear and uncertainty, were everywhere. Everything was in chaos. The saddest moment for me came when my mother and uncle parted. I remember my mother begging my uncle to come with us, but he couldn't, as his family wasn't with him. They embraced and sobbed for what seemed like the longest time. It was a profound and emotional moment for me to witness. I knew my uncle's weekly visits would never happen again. We were led into the airport terminal where we staged and waited and ate what little food my parents were able to pack in our carry-ons and continued to wait anxiously. My father had made a cardboard sign with the number 16. 13 children in all, my aunt, father, and 5.5-month pregnant mother. A few days passed and terror erupted again as the front of the airport was bombed. Thousands of people huddled towards the back area of the terminal. Children cried in desperation, looking for their mothers or fathers. People scrambled with whatever they had in hand, screaming and crying. It was a state of utter chaos. Throughout, our family of 16 held hands and huddled tightly so as not to be separated. We were informed the airport would soon shut down due to the consistent barrage of bombings, and that only people with proper documentation would be allowed to leave. This meant the U.S. military support staff and South Vietnamese personnel and their families. Even though we would qualify, my parents thought there was a slim chance that this many people would be evacuated and that we should return home while still possible. During the confusion, my aunt approached a U.S. soldier with her 3 young daughters in tow and pleaded that if she and her young daughters stayed or were left behind, they would all be tortured or killed because of her employment with the U.S. Embassy. The soldier empathized and agreed to let my aunt and her daughters through the checkpoint. She added that she also had her sister's family with her, and since her brother-in-law was a former officer in the South Vietnamese Army, that he would also certainly meet torture or death. An additional complication was that my father had no official paperwork for our family at the time. The soldier asked how many members there would be in total, and my aunt replied 16. His initial response was that our family size was now too big and it would be impossible for him to get everyone through. But her continued pleading paid off. The soldier finally agreed, but gave very specific instructions. He told my aunt to return with both families at 7 a.m. the next morning. He informed her that there will be 2 lines, one for the people with paperwork and the other for families without. He instructed her to go straight to the paperwork line and for our family to follow and to keep moving, and that he would be there to give us a hand signal to pass. My aunt went back to my parents and begged them not to go back home and to take this chance, and there would be no opportunity again. My parents were nervous and unsure because our fate was completely dependent upon this unknown stranger. After much back and forth, my parents agreed. The next morning, we followed the instructions and approached the gate where he was stationed. we waited for his hand signal and kept walking behind my aunt, who had her papers in hand. This unknown stranger and compassionate human being, our angel, let us pass by and onto our chance for freedom. We then proceeded towards a waiting helicopter, and I vividly remember the deafening sounds from rotating propellers as soldiers frantically instructed us to board. I remember my parents telling us to hold each other's hands and not let go. We were packed in like sardines. The cries of fear and the smell of sweat was overwhelming. So many thoughts raced through my mind. I was fearful of the unknown. I was afraid we would crash or get shot down by the enemy. Every minute seemed like an eternity. As we flew out to sea, intense rain poured down and dark, stormy skies made our flight even more ominous. As we landed on the Midway, the scene was chaotic. I heard my mother's voice counting aloud to make sure all 16 were present. I remember seeing so many American sailors. Some were helping the elderly, some were caring for the injured, and some carried babies, which I now believe were mostly orphans. I remember being surrounded by desperation. Once on board, we slept outside on deck as we were one of the last groups to land on the Midway. We were provided blankets which we used to spread out on the deck and sheets we used to shield ourselves from sun and wind. And I felt a strange sense of freedom from the fresh ocean air. In retrospect, this was a blessing because many people below deck passed illnesses from one to another due to cramped living quarters. Many families had to confront death at sea, as did my infant sister, Chrissy, who was gravely ill due to malnutrition. My father contemplated the unthinkable, the real possibility of having to commit her to sea. But my mother's maternal instinct and refusal to give up saved her life. Daily meals were served in small white foam cups filled halfway with soggy rice and sardines. Although I never liked sardines, I was extremely grateful to have something to eat. Watered down powdered carnation milk was rationed to stretch supply for the thousands of refugees on board. A vivid memory was temporary restrooms on the upper deck constructed of wood planks that stretched out over the open ocean, with bed sheets strung up for privacy. These makeshift accommodations needed in order to provide for our care were quickly handmade, and I also remember these sailors doing their routine walks throughout the day, checking in on our welfare, which made me finally feel protected and safe. I somehow realized that every single displaced person on board, young and old, was embarking on the same unknown journey. Some of us soon-to-be Americans, which included our family, were once well off. Now, all of us were homeless, left with only limited possessions we were able to hand carry with us. Even under these crazy circumstances, I felt a strange sense of peace as I was grateful to be with my family as we embraced our newfound fate together. And I recall often rubbing my mother's stomach with anticipation of my new baby brother or sister. One of my cherished memories came after meals. I couldn't wait along with my siblings to gather with the sailors who told us stories about America, jokes, and on occasion entertained us with magic tricks. The crew was always kind and helpful. A highlight was when we had our first taste of M&Ms, which is still my favorite treat until today. We sailed at sea for a week and arrived at Subic Bay in the Philippines, so we stayed for almost a month. We then moved to Wake Island for 2 more months, and then boarded a transport plane to our final destination, Camp Pendleton, the USA, in July of 1975, where my youngest sister was also born on July 22nd. She was given the name Handful, which means happiness. Sadly, My mother succumbed to stomach cancer in 1978. Sorry. Just 3 short years after our arrival, I always felt the stress of war and what she gave of herself to bring our family through to America and freedom took its toll on her body. She will always be my hero. My journey to America is, of course, something I will never forget. My family and I are forever grateful and will cherish our time spent on the Midway and at Camp Pendleton. We were always treated with kindness and respect, and not as refugees by brave men and women who were summoned to fight a foreign world war and rescue helpless strangers. Their dedication, bravery, and sacrifice made it possible for my family and me, along with so many like me, to be able to realize the American dream. I pray our children will never have to experience war. I still get emotional whenever I watch archival footage from the war. We've come so far. Our history must pass on to younger generations. Future generations must understand and appreciate the price so many paid for the freedom they now enjoy. I still get chills every time I recite the words to our national anthem, and came across a slightly modified quote from the anthem that left a huge impact on me. Land of the free, because of the brave. And I would like to add to that quote, Midway brave. Freedom is something that should never be taken for granted. There is so much good in the world. I personally witnessed the best of humanity from so many in the armed forces, including Admiral Larry Chambers and veterans like you in attendance, who came to Vietnam to save thousands, including an 8-year-old child like me. I am therefore forever a proud American and would like to express my deepest gratitude to all veterans on this special day. Thank you.
Thank you, Courtney. It's now my distinct pleasure to introduce retired Commander Everett Alvarez.
Thank you. Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here. Pleasure to meet a lot of people like yourselves. Pleasure to talk to folks I hadn't seen in a long time. Especially good to see some of my old colleagues sitting on the front here. Jack, everyone up there. Earl. Earl says the other day, he said, you look pretty young and you look good, and we made a vow. I'll tell you what, you tell me that I look young and still look good, and I'll tell you, you haven't changed a bit. You're still young, still little. It's a real pleasure to be here again. Like I said, it's always good to come back to San Diego. San Diego always had the best, most pleasant weather of the continental United States. What happened to it? When I got up this morning and I looked out over the harbor here, looked across and towards North Island, and I recall our carrier, the USS Constellation, was home ported right here, and it was from this spot in May of 1964 that we left on our second cruise. I had made the Connie's first cruise, but then we went back out again on the second Westpac cruise. And we found ourselves what is today, or later was called Yankee Station on the South China Sea in August, when incidents happened that led up to what is known as the Tonkin Gulf incident. And I recall having pulled out of Hong Kong early that morning because things were happening out there. And we raced to that position off of Vietnam. And as we sped as fast as the ship could go, we received word that two of our destroyers, the Maddox and the Turner Joy, were under attack by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. And this is the second time that had happened, because a similar thing happened a few days before. So the call came out. We needed some A4s to launch and go to their aid. So three of us took off about 10 o'clock that night. We headed out over the spot where we thought the torpedo boats and the destroyers were. Couldn't see because it was not only night, it was pretty stormy. But at some point I remember them asking if anybody had flares. Turns out there was a young Lieutenant J.G. that was carrying flares. And that young Lieutenant J.G. was me. So I pulled down, went down, lit up the sky underneath the overcast. And as I did, I could see our two destroyers. But it was a lot of turmoil, and it was stormy, and we didn't see much else. When we got back to the ship after midnight, and we landed. We were briefed by the Admiral, and the Admiral wanted to know what we saw, and I remember saying, we saw the destroyers, but we didn't see anything else. It was just too stormy. So that was it for that night. Went to bed. Next morning the phone rang and I was called to go up to Air Intelligence to brief on a flight. And our target for our squadron was north of Haiphong at a naval base called Hanoi. And as we were planning the flight, our air group commander walked in and he said, "This is a go. President Johnson just announced that we were striking targets off on the coast of Vietnam." Now, it was 11 a.m. there in the morning. It was 11 p.m. in Washington, D.C. And I recall that the conversation included that the president wanted to get to the American people before they went to bed. So what happened is that the Vietnamese had about 5 hours notice when we hit our target. And I have to say that we were surprised at how ready they were. There was an awful lot of flak, an awful lot of anti-aircraft fire coming up. And as you heard earlier, I was hit. I was very fortunate. I ejected at a very low level, and somehow I made it because I felt my parachute pop open, And one or two swings at the most, I found myself in the water. And the Vietnamese picked me up right off the coast, took me into the port that we had just struck, and I was held in a local jail for a while, and then taken to another location, then another location, and about a week later, I entered the famous prison in Vietnam that we later nicknamed the Hanoi Hilton. And 6 months later, as we had another raid, and the raids were starting up, and Bob Shoemaker was the second pilot shot down, and then the third pilot, then the fourth pilot, and then so many others. These fellows right here got into the act later in the war. I'm glad you guys showed up. I don't know how long we would have been there had you guys not shown up. So thank you for coming. So today, and in this event, and similar to other events that are being held around the country, we're all in commemoration of the end of the war, as you've heard before. And there are some very, very good accounts of people's experiences at that time. 50 years goes fast, but the memories, I think, still linger. They certainly do for me, and I'm sure I can say that that also is true for you. I can remember 50 years ago today, the last contingent of the POWs coming out today. I remember watching you guys that came out with that very last group. I was in the hospital. I was watching television as you came off the plane, and I can't believe. And we were really sort of holding our breath, because it was not until every single one of you, not until every single POW was out of there and home safely could we talk about the truth of how we were treated and of our experience, and especially those of us who'd been in the Hanoi March and the torture for propaganda that followed that event and many other events. So we couldn't say anything about it because we didn't want anything to happen that would slow up your coming out. And I recall that was a big day. 50 years ago, the POWs came back, and we found the country in a celebrity wanting to celebrate, because it was the end of a long and divisive war. And in many respects, we received a hero's welcome. But as you heard before, it was completely opposite for most of you that had come home. And I remember not only the stories of how you were treated, but I remember my wife telling me how when she worked with the airlines, how they had to take the troops around to board the plane so they wouldn't be facing the public and things of that nature. It wasn't right. It wasn't fair, because as veterans, we recall that we would go wherever we were called and wherever we were sent. And you fellows, you answered the country's call. You're the ones that put your lives on hold, and whether you were draftees or volunteers, you did your duty, you served, and then you came home and you continued your lives. You contributed to your country. Later on in my career, I had the privilege of serving President Ronald Reagan's administration. And I had served as first as a deputy and then the acting head of the VA system. And I've had the pleasure of working with the Veterans Service Organizations, the American Legion, VFW, the DAV, with their leadership in Washington, D.C. I had the honor of setting up some of the veteran programs. And I can say that I did a lot of work with the Vietnam vets, especially setting up your vet centers, what we at those days call the Vietnam Vet Walk-in Centers. And I can say with all candor that Vietnam vets, you guys are a resilient group. You've produced a lot of good things for our country. But what stands out in my mind, and I can see this actually right here, that you have a brotherhood. You got folks consider each other brothers. And that's what's really, I think, very significant. And we've learned a lot of lessons from Vietnam. But what I can truly say that, in my mind, the biggest lesson is that we must honor the service of our military men and women. And we see that today in our attitude towards the men and women who are serving our country today. I think that whether we agree with our government's policies or not, we must come together to support our young men and women. Today, as we commemorate the end of the Vietnam War for our combat troops, I just want to add this one thought, and that's following up on Roy Knight's comments. I'm talking about the ones that never came home. I think that if we look back, that ever since the end of our war in Vietnam, the government has persisted with the same vigor and the same purpose to account for those fellows that have not come. And it's, if you think about it, the tremendous amount of resources that the Department of Defense deploys in that mission of accounting for those, it's huge. There's a lot of personnel. I personally visited the facility that we have outside of Hanoi in Vietnam. We call it the ranch, where our teams are housed as they work on their job of looking for remains. I visited the lab in Hawaii, where they identify the remains. And it's amazing that how much effort there is. We're reminded of that, as you heard before, by the POW MIA flag that flies all over the country. And I think that we can all agree that accounting for every MIA pursued in every reasonable manner has a meaningful purpose to their families, like you, Roy, to their memory. I think that we can all agree we have that obligation until the final chapter can be closed. It's been a pleasure to be with you. These gatherings of the Vietnam group, as we get older, grayer, better looking, are really meaningful. They mean a lot to me, and I'm very appreciative for having the chance to be here today. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Could I have one more standing ovation for these four amazing individuals? Thank you very much, everyone. So at this point, we would like to pay tribute to the men and women who paid the ultimate sacrifice in Vietnam, as well as those Vietnam veterans who have passed away since the end of the war. And through our wreath-laying ceremony, we're showing our eternal gratitude and our respect as we remember the fallen. And today we have wreaths. If we could have the wreaths, you can see the wreaths off here on your left for each of the 5 service branches. So the Coast Guard, Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marines. And if I could ask Everett and Jim, Courtney, Roy, and I also have a retired quartermaster, Mark Mellinger. Where's Mark? Is he coming up? Yep, Mark, if you could come on over. And we also have retired Army Colonel Mike Zolezi. And if you could accompany our sailors and officers over to the riser against the rail on the port side for the wreath-laying ceremony. And we've also passed out individual yellow roses, individual yellow carnations to everybody. So if you could also make your way over to the port rail and join in the wreath laying. And once the wreath are actually set. I'll give a countdown from 3, and we'll have the wreaths tossed over the side, and if you could also then toss your yellow flowers. So if everybody with a yellow flower could also make their way over to the port rail.
I'm gonna be about right here.
And I'll go ahead, and when everyone's ready, to go ahead with the wreath laying ceremony portion.
You don't. You should. It shouldn't be the echo. Yes.
So on the count of 3, 1, 2, 3. And we can all return back to the seating area now. Thank you. That's, yeah. That's when I'm going to come back. I'd now like to ask Chappie to come back to the podium for the benediction.
Let us pray. Almighty God, as we depart the flight deck of the USS Midway, where missions were launched to fight for freedom, and where Vietnamese refugees tasted freedom for the first time and became fellow citizens, may our observance serve as a reminder that our freedom was purchased at a high cost and should never be taken for granted. Let every veteran of our nation's armed forces feel truly and appropriately honored by the attention and appreciation by their fellow citizens. Let no one feel forgotten or neglected. Let every man and woman, young and old, feel the deep and enduring gratitude of your blessing upon our nation and its citizens. Amen.
So thank you everybody for coming today. For all the Vietnam veterans, if you go back to either our outreach or our check-in booths, we have not only the Vietnam veteran lapel pin, but also a very special Midway Vietnam War Veterans Challenge coins that we'd like you all to take with you. I know it's a blustery day, but everybody that's here is able to stay on board and on the board the ship and enjoy the Midway. And also we have some wonderful exhibits, POW exhibits, art exhibits that salute the veterans and those still on active duty down in our hangar. So thank you again all for coming, and we wish you, even on this rainy, blustery day, fair winds and following seas. Thank you.